You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Americans say they're feeling bad. This has been the theme of our election series since we kicked things off in January. And the number one issue we've heard from voters is that they don't want to vote for either the Democratic or Republican candidates. Maybe you know exactly how they feel. The war in Gaza is weakening support for the incumbent Joe Biden. Donald Trump's hush money trial is forcing questions about the legality of his candidacy, and the third-party candidate, Robert Kennedy Jr., could play spoiler as he siphons votes from both Biden and Trump. As of mid-May, RFK Jr. is polling at only 10% of registered voters nationally, but in the battleground states, where the election might be decided, he's making both major parties nervous. The impact of another well-known third-party candidate is looming over millions of Americans. They remember what happened in 1992, in 2000, in 2016, and they just know it's going to be another close vote. When we talk about third-party politics, we tend to look at it from a national lens. But what does nonpartisan politics mean for communities that don't fit the Democratic-Republican labels?
I've always kind of had non-typical interests. When I was a little kid, I was really into sports, but my favorite professional sports were indoor lacrosse and arena football.
That's 47-year-old Greg Stempfle.
I grew up in Dearborn, which is a suburb just west of Detroit. I didn't necessarily have the best time growing up in high school. I started to identify with some students, myself included, that just got bullied around. So that's where I really started to root for the underdog. And then when I got into politics, I knew the things that were presented to me as common mainstream options weren't always going to fit with me, and I didn't feel really like I identified with the Democrats or Republicans.
Greg is a registered libertarian. He's run for a House seat every 2 years since 1998, and from 2019 to 2021, was Michigan's Libertarian State Party chair.
I hate using left and right to describe things. It's not a very accurate or descriptive term. You're trying to boil down political philosophy into two options, and I think that's kind of an outdated paradigm.
Greg, of course, wants to see more representation for third-party candidates like libertarians. He's also concerned about what the two-party system is doing to our country.
I think we're becoming increasingly divisive and divided. I think social media especially has gotten people to only listen to people that have their own viewpoint. We're getting extreme candidates all over the board, ending up in the general elections.
Greg's now getting an up-close look at how that's affecting his own party, which once prided itself on being independent of Democrats and Republicans.
There's a group that took control of the Libertarian Party a couple years ago called the Mises Caucus. And in many ways, they're similar to the MAGA movement within the Republican Party.
When we spoke with Greg, he was gearing up for the Libertarian National Convention that kicks off May 24th.
You may have heard in the news that our national chair invited Donald Trump to our convention, which has upset a lot of people. And so we're worried that there may be a faction of our party that doesn't nominate a candidate because some people might want Trump. It's like inviting Ronald McDonald to the grand opening of a Burger King restaurant. Why are we having an opponent come address us when we're nominating someone to run against him?
Despite our country's polarized politics, Greg's found a place where he feels at home. Ferndale is a town about 15 miles north of where he grew up, in Dearborn.
It's become known as a little bit of an alternative counterculture area of the city. You'll find your gay bars and your vegan restaurants here.
Ferndale, like most cities in Michigan, has nonpartisan local elections. That makes it harder for people showing up at the ballot box to simply vote along party lines.
There's no R or D by their name, so if you want to know who to vote for, you have to do a little bit more research.
Greg says that it's made politics less bitter, and in general, people are happier. He admits Ferndale's city council would be overwhelmingly Democratic if it did allow for party labels. But Greg thinks Republican and independent voters at least don't feel disenfranchised by the system.
Another reason why I don't like partisan elections is then you're tied to a national political party. Ferndale politics shouldn't deal with free trade and international relations, but if you're a member of a Democrat or Republican, then it gets roped into that because you're part of that party.
Ferndale's system might sound like political utopia, but Greg would tell you there are still problems to solve. For example, the city has yet to implement a ranked choice voting initiative that voters approved more than 2 decades ago. It would allow voters to rank candidates in order of their preference rather than using the current winner-take-all system. For Greg, that feels like he'd have a bigger voice in local, state, and primary elections.
As much as things are getting divisive, there are more and more people that just don't like the current system. If there are a structural change they could vote for on the ballot, like a ranked choice voting, they might jump at that opportunity to try to make politics a little bit better.
To help us understand what it's like to govern a city with a fierce independent streak and ambitions to shake up how we vote, we're joined by Kat Bruner James. She was elected to the Ferndale, Michigan City Council in 2020 and served for a single term till 2023. She's been a community leader for decades. She's a civil rights attorney and a partner at the law firm Goodman, Hurwitz & James in Detroit. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Hi, Ray.
Well, tell me about Ferndale. What kind of place is it?
It's a small but mighty town where a lot of professionals who work in downtown Detroit live. Also, a lot of working class folks who work in auto factories nearby, servers, retailers. And we're a pretty progressive town, especially in this region. We tend to be first adopters of a lot of progressive policies.
So an inner ring suburb just beyond the Detroit city limits. You've been an activist, a community leader for a long time. What made you decide to enter elective politics? Was it a hard decision to become an insider after pushing from the outside for so long?
Not a hard decision at all. The only thing that was difficult was prioritizing the time that it really takes to be an effective elected public servant. It's something that I actually wanted to do for many years because one of the things that I found so appealing about this community is that I found our elected officials to be very approachable, very receptive. And I sort of wanted to pay that forward for the folks who had treated me with such open arms. I wanted to be that for someone else coming up behind us.
Did it take some adjustment, some recalibration of how you think about government, being on the inside rather than on the outside?
I had a constant daily identity crisis. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's really easy when you are an activist who's critical of government action to get entrenched in an anti-government bias and sort of lose sight of the fact that government is run by people who are individuals, often just trying to do what they believe is right.
I've covered some races where community activists, nonprofit leaders have become elected officials, and suddenly they're explaining to constituents why it's not so easy to do the things that they were demanding a couple of minutes ago that government do. Did you have that experience?
For sure. I mean, for example, instant runoff voting, as I knew it 20 years ago, was something that I was passionate about and worked with a team to actually amend the city charter to allow for instant runoff voting. Now we tend to call it ranked choice voting. It's been 22 years now since it has been authorized under the Ferndale City Charter. Getting it implemented and actually having it used in elections turns out to be so much harder than just explaining it to people and getting support and approving the concept of it.
I like the name instant runoff because I think it gives people a little better idea of what the stakes are. How does it work?
So the way that it works is it's very much the same way that it works when you go to a restaurant, you have your favorite menu item in mind, and your server says, "I'm so sorry, we just ran out of that item. Do you have a second choice?" Conceptually, that's how I like to describe it to people, because we rank our choices all the time in everyday life. So the way that it works on your ballot is exactly that. You select who is your top choice, who is your second choice. You can choose as many ranks as there are typically on the ballot, or you can do what's plunking. A lot of people would advocate for, if there's one candidate who is do or die and no one else will be acceptable to you, then it's your choice if you'd like to select one candidate as your first choice and stop right there.
Is this, in Ferndale's case, also nonpartisan in addition to being ranked choice?
So in Ferndale, we still have not yet implemented ranked choice voting. So the way that it would work, even in partisan elections, suppose your first choice is a third-party candidate. As a longtime Green Party member and a person who prefers the more progressive policies of the Green Party, I would often, if I had the option, select a Green Party candidate as my top choice. But given the political realities of our system, that one of the major party candidates is most likely to win, I may want to back up that first choice vote with a second choice. Probably in my case, it would be for the Democratic candidate. Now, for people of different political ideologies, they might go a different route. Their first choice might be Libertarian with a second choice Republican. Or people are actually politically sophisticated and nuanced and maybe all over the map, depending on what issues are most important to them. So under a ranked choice voting system, I think people have the opportunity to not be constrained by, a party's identity or a party's platform, and actually select candidates based on who they think is best, and have a backup for who might be more realistically elected.
During your time as an elected official, did you come to some conclusions about the role that parties play in our politics more broadly? And would you change that?
I haven't strongly identified with either the Green Party nor the Democratic Party in quite some time, because I observed a lot of behavior where I felt like in either instance, party was prioritized over policy. Now, when it comes to party activities themselves, sure, I get that. But when you have candidates or public officials who are perhaps acting in the best interest of a party, as opposed to really making good policy decisions and listening to their constituents and working with colleagues who might be of another party, I think strong party ideology can interfere with good policy and good relationships.
That you can't assume what either an official or a candidate is for or against by what party banner they're running under? Have you found that to be true?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that on a national level, we assume a lot of sort of entrenched positions on, aligning a certain issue with a certain party. But in reality, people don't tend to operate that way. They might be fairly conservative on one issue and fairly progressive on another issue. I think people are feeling more and more alienated by parties because we're more complicated than parties would tend to label us as voters. And as, let's even set aside the voter moniker, we're people being represented by others in our government who just want good policy that work for us and our neighbors.
At a lot of levels of government, people who run for public office often promise as part of their campaigns that they're not going to forget where they came from. They're not going to forget who they serve, that they're still going to be the same kind of person. And they understand that there's a perception that being elected and heading to the Capitol or the county board means that you're going to become a different kind of person. Is there any way of preventing that? Is there any way that we could restructure our politics in a way to bring us closer to that ideal of the citizen servant, the citizen legislator, and so on?
It's funny because in Michigan, many years ago, the state imposed some fairly strict term limits, which in the long run, we all learned that having overly severe term limits was actually a disadvantage because the legislature was consistently full of freshman or sophomore members who, by the time they really learned the job and built the relationships and started to get things done, they were limited, time to turn it over to somebody else.
So you're sending your institutional memory out the door once
Exactly right. But, I think it's also important to think that we are going to evolve as we learn more. So we're going to change. We're not going to be that exact same activist person who frankly knew less about the inner workings. We're going to learn more about the inner workings. Some of those inner workings we're going to want to change to make it more accessible to others. Some of those inner workings are going to change how we think and give us some insight into how to do things differently. So again, I think it's sort of a balance between learning the role and improving your approach to the end result that you want to affect, but not evolving so much that you're losing sight of why you started.
Let's say you could have a hand in redesigning the way the machinery works right now. How would you change it? Given the hold that parties have on the process, on ballot access, on fundraising, on paying to communicate with the voting public, is it really practical to imagine, if not a post-party future, at least a future where parties play a different role?
Mm-hmm. My fantasy on the national level would be open primaries with ranked choice voting. Because I think our primaries, while I understand the notion of parties controlling the system of how they nominate their candidate, conceptually, I understand that. As a voter who would like to be able to engage in more nuanced decision-making, I would urge parties to evolve towards something more democratic that allows for more participation and more nuance. And voters can select which ballot they want. You don't have to be registered as a Republican. You don't have to be registered as a Democrat. You can simply ask when you go to vote for the Democrat or Republican ballot and vote for whichever one strikes your fancy on that day.
So you can change your stripes as you're walking into the voting booth.
Exactly right. So it's up to you whether you want to strategically vote for the candidate of the party who most aligns with you, and you want to vote for the person who you ultimately want to vote for in November, or if you want to cross over to the party that you're not as aligned with and vote for the person who you think maybe doesn't stand a great chance in November, so you want your candidate to clobber that person. At least you have that option. So when I speak of open primaries, I'm talking about, allowing voters to vote in whichever party primary they choose. Because I don't think that most voters consistently or always want to be constrained to a single party.
Michigan's been a pivotal state in national elections in recent cycles. What does RFK Jr. mean to the kind of left-right, blue-red, Republican-Democrat binary? Does RFK, by making the ballot in a key state like Michigan, have the potential to upend the November election?
It's interesting because he might siphon votes from anywhere and everywhere. I'm certain that he will attract some voters who are just so frustrated by Democrats and Republicans that they're going to want anything but. And in Michigan, it is hard to predict who he's going to pull from or potentially so-called spoil the election for.
Well, what about that spoiler critique? Does that represent a fly in the ointment or a necessary precondition to opening up our politics?
I'll be candid with you. When I am deciding early on in my early adulthood what my political affiliation may be, one of the things that attracted me to the Green Party and the third party politics in general was, in fact, the spoiler effect. I was frustrated with the Democratic Party that it was trying to steer for the center and really, I felt, shutting out progressives. And my thought was, okay, well, if you aren't going to court me, then I'm going to go elsewhere. And if that spoils your dinner, spoils your election, that's your problem, not mine. But I hope that you take it as a lesson that I need to be courted, that you need to give me a reason to vote for you. And when I have perceived the Democratic Party to not get that message. And I found the spoiler moniker, the spoiler blame, to be so unproductive when really Democrats and Greens aligned much more than Democrats and Republicans or Greens and Republicans. But I saw that division being entrenched and even more polarized, even farther apart. And it frustrated me very much, which is sort of what caused me to step back away from the party politics and really focus on systems and individual policies. If we can work on individual policies together, if we're both pro-choice, then I don't care what party we align with. We have something in common. Let's work together on it. So for a long time now, I have felt much more like an independent because parties really turn me off. As a practical matter, I fully acknowledge that I am mostly voting for Democrats and I vote for Green Party candidates when I'm not afraid of the consequence of potentially spoiling it for one of the major party candidates.
Kat Bruner James was a member of the city council in Ferndale, Michigan. She's a civil rights attorney at the law firm Goodman, Hurwitz, and James in Detroit. Great to talk to you.
Thanks, Ray. Great to talk to you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you, with special support from Mark and Maury Jane Perry and Anne and Greg Avis. Today's episode was produced by Adam Ailey and Matteo Schimpf. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.